A new record number of air travelers are taking to the skies this weekend, according to the TSA. That's despite severe weather in parts of the country. And there will be more extreme weather this summer. The 2024 hurricane season is projected to be busy, according to both U.S. and World Meteorological Organization predictions. We spoke with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg on Friday and began by asking if federal regulations need to change to deal with increased air turbulence.
The reality is the effects of climate change are already upon us in terms of our transportation. We've seen that in the form of everything from heat waves that shouldn't statistically even be possible, threatening to melt the cables of transit systems in the Pacific Northwest, to hurricane seasons becoming more and more extreme, and indications that turbulence is up by about 15%. That means assessing anything and everything that we can do about it.
Here in the U.S.?
Well, in the atmosphere generally. But certainly something that will affect American travelers, whether here or abroad. Now, there are protocols and patterns for things like how pilots who encounter turbulence can notify those who might be coming in the path. But I do think we need to continually reevaluate that in the face of the reality that these things are more frequent and more severe than before.
That horrific video that people were terrified by when they saw the Singapore Airlines encounter such severe turbulence that actually killed someone. Yeah. That was rare. But you're saying you do expect to see more incidents like that here in the U.S.?
To be clear, something that extreme is very rare. But turbulence can happen, and sometimes it can happen unexpectedly. Our climate is evolving, our policies and our technology and our infrastructure have to evolve accordingly too. This is all about making sure that we stay ahead of the curve, keeping aviation as safe as it is. It's not for nothing that it became the safest form of travel in America.
Boeing released a report that said they saw a 500% increase in the number of employee submissions about safety concerns during the first 2 months of 2024. This is, of course, after all these high-profile incidents that happened with that plane door just flying off. It's good employees are seeing something and saying something, but a 500% increase, I mean, that would suggest that there are actual issues here.
That's right. There's an encouraging part and a concerning part. The encouraging part is we want Boeing and any producer in the aviation space to have a culture of, if you see something, say something. We want to make sure those mechanisms for reporting work. We have both whistleblower mechanisms to let us know something directly at the FAA, but in a healthy company, that should also be happening within the company.
Were they discouraging it earlier?
If there were evidence of that would lead to direct action. I'm not here to make an accusation like that at this time. If anything, we want you to err on the side of reporting. So that's the encouraging part. The concerning part, of course, is that any of those issues are happening at all. Right. And that's why Boeing is under a huge amount of scrutiny right now, including from the FAA. The administrator took the extraordinary step of saying that Boeing cannot increase their production until they've demonstrated that they can do it safely.
That FAA decision also goes with it, that 90-day timeline and report that Boeing has to hand in.
That ends more or less right at the end of May. So we're coming up on the period where Boeing will put forward their plan. FAA will assess it, then begins a process of accountability, monitoring, making sure they're conforming to that plan and that it's getting the results that it should.
That doesn't sound like that moves quickly. I mean, the FAA administrator was on another network this week and said Boeing has a long road ahead to improve safety. How quickly is this going to move?
Yeah, there needs to be some major change, and that's not overnight work. Now, to be clear, if there were an immediate safety issue, anytime there is, FAA acts immediately. It's why it took the extraordinary step of grounding, for example, all of those 737 MAX 9 aircraft until they could be specifically inspected and returned to service.
So that hold is not going to be lifted next week when this report is turned in. That's what it sounds like.
They're going to have to do more to demonstrate their readiness to safely increase production. And again, obviously the goal is for them to do so, but only on a safe and healthy basis.
I want to ask you about something that we hear quite a lot about on the campaign trail, and that is electric cars, electric vehicles. Donald Trump repeatedly talks about President Biden's decision to force the industry towards making 56% of car batteries electric by 2032, 13% hybrid. Listen to what he said in New Jersey recently.
Do you notice he's trying to save the electrical vehicle, but not the gas-powered, which is the vehicle that everybody wants. They're going crazy with the electric car, costing us a fortune. We're spending hundreds of billions of dollars subsidizing a car that nobody wants and nobody's ever going to buy.
He's not wrong.
Oh, he's
on
wrong.
the purchasing. He's not. Of the 4 million vehicles purchased, 269,000 electric vehicles were sold in the U.S. market. It's up like
and
2%.
Every single year, more Americans buy EVs than the year. Well,
aren't
this
we
is really
seeing it move
important.
more quickly?
Every single year, more Americans buy EVs than the year prior. There are two things that I think are needed for that to happen even more quickly. One is the price, which is why the Inflation Reduction Act acted to cut the price of an electric vehicle. The second is making sure we have the charging network we need across America. But I want to talk about the bigger point here. And I take this very personally because I grew up in the industrial Midwest, literally in the shadow of broken down factories from car companies that did not survive into the turn of the century because they didn't keep up with the times.
And many of those auto workers are concerned that electric vehicles require fewer humans to manufacture.
The most important thing is that the EV revolution will happen with or without us, and we've got to make sure that it's American-led. Mm-hmm. And that's what the president is focused on. We don't want China. Look, under the Trump administration, they allowed China to build an advantage in the EV industry. But under President Biden's leadership, we're making sure that the EV revolution will be a made-in-America EV revolution that is critically important.
Because of these tariffs you're talking about that President Biden says he's going to roll out.
Also just making sure we invest in America's capacity, making sure that we are onshoring or friend-shoring the materials and the processing of what goes into these EVs, making sure that America masters these processes. Because, look, there's no way that we're going to get to the middle of this century with the technology that we counted on a century ago. Now, there are obviously a lot of voices here in Washington who are interested in keeping the status quo.
He says it's going to be one of the first things he does.
Would be happy to see Americans trapped with dirty and expensive fuels. But the reality, and I know he's made a lot of promises to the oil and gas CEOs about some of the favors that he believes
but
his
it
administration
obviously is
will deliver
resonating
for them.
for him because he wouldn't bring it up so frequently if there wasn't some anxiety that he's tapping into. And let me ask you about a portion of this that I think does fall under your portfolio, and that's the charging stations you mentioned. The Federal Highway Administration says only 7 or 8 charging stations have been produced with a $7.5 billion investment that taxpayers made back in 2021. Why isn't that happening more quickly?
So the president's goal is to have 500,000 chargers up by the end of this decade. Now, in order to do a charger, it's more than just plunking a small device into the ground. There's utility work, and this is also really a new category of federal investment. But we've been working with each of the 50 states. Every one of them is getting formula dollars to do this work, engaging them in the first handful. Again, by 2030, 500,000 chargers. And the very first handful of chargers are now already being physically built. But again, that's the absolute very, very beginning stages of the construction to come. The reason that we're investing federal dollars is to fill in some of the gaps in areas where it is not yet profitable for the private sector to do it. Now, again, the majority of charging will happen at home. And in some senses, an electric vehicle has more in common. Fueling it has more in common with charging your phone than it does with filling up a gas car in ways that are both helpful and challenging. But that is exactly the transition that America is going through right now. And the other thing, again, is the price, right? We have seen the cost of EVs fall to now where it's within a few percent of an equivalent gas car. Depending on the model, you may come out ahead now.